Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Edric Show. I am your host, Edric Jerome. This is the place for intelligent conversation with interesting people. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, ring that notification bell, and you'll get notified when I post content each and every week. I want to welcome my guest for today's show is renowned author Fred Waitzkin. His latest novel, Anything is Good, explores the complexities of friendship, loss, and the human condition. Fred is also known for his memoir, Searching for Bobby Fischer, which chronicled the life of his son, Josh Waitzkin, a child chess prodigy. He's also written for the New York Times Magazine, Esquire, and Forbes. Fred's unique ability to blend personal experiences with insightful commentary has solidified his reputation as a compelling and thought-provoking author, and I'm honored to have you on the show. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me, man. Thank you.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. First of all, let me start with the book. You write about your friendship with Ralph Silverman, and I guess my question is, what inspired you to write about this friendship, and why did you decide to tell his compelling story?
Well, I was in between books. I hadn't been writing anything for maybe 6 months. And in between books is a difficult time for me, and it was particularly difficult, exponentially more difficult, because I'd lost two of my closest friends. And Ralph and I were very, very close friends in high school. I hadn't spoken to him in several years, but I knew he lived in Fort Lauderdale, but I didn't know if he was okay, if he was still alive. And I rang him up one day, and we started to have a talk. And I asked him questions about. I knew there was a period of time in his life when he disappeared. And I started asking him some questions about it. And he started telling me this story that was so astonishing and unexpected and bizarre and fascinating that that one phone call became scores of phone calls. And those scores of phone calls became a book.
One of the compelling aspects of the book is you touch and tackle the subject of homelessness, which is a pervasive problem here in the United States, as we all know. But in addition to your conversations with Ralph and his experiences, what other type of research did you do on this subject? Because were you aware of the significance of the problem going in, or how did you research to write about this in such a compelling way?
Well, I'm a New Yorker. I live in just south of Greenwich Village, and I have an office on 28th Street. And homeless people are all over the place. In the area of my office in Chelsea, on 28th Street, it's the flower district, and there are beautiful flower shops. Virtually at every storefront is a flower shop. But in between the flower shops are homeless people sleeping on the sidewalk, just on the granite sidewalk. Often not even sleeping on cardboard with their heads on the ground, often without their shoes on. Some people without any clothes on at all. But as a New Yorker, you learn to take it for granted. That's just what's become of the city. Because from what I've read, almost 250,000 homeless people have moved into New York in the last months. So the homeless condition, you just sort of take it for granted. You see homeless people lying all over the place, freezing in the winter, boiling in the summer, starving, and you see them, and they look like the furniture of the city. I mean, you don't even see them in terms of the full people, the deep humanity that they are. We just see them as part of the street furniture of New York. And so my idea was I knew that Ralph was a homeless person for a period of time, but I didn't know the details, and I didn't know very much about him. I knew a little bit because at one point I visited him for a day or so I guess it must have been 15 or 20, no, it's longer than that. It was 25 years ago. And I wrote a piece about it for the New York Times Magazine, but I knew very little about him. And I thought that the juxtaposition between my vision of homeless living in New York, which is pretty much consistent with what other people feel about homeless people in New York, relative to the real truth of the matter, is manifested in the life of my dear high school friend, living homeless person for 20 years. would make a compelling book.
And that leads into my next question, because one of the things that you are able to do so well is you are able to write about that subject with authenticity and honesty. And so I guess my question is, what were some of the challenging aspects of writing about a subject like that with your friend with such authenticity, so it doesn't come across as, exploitive or something like that?
Right. Well, that's a great question. I mean, I have a little practice at it. Um, After I wrote Searching for Bobby, I was never a chess player. I mean, I'm very, very, excuse me, a very poor amateur chess player. But I'm a good observer. And so I watched chess players play it. When I decided that I wanted to write Searching for Bobby Fischer, I watched a lot of chess and I absorbed the nuances of the game, the psychological nuances of the game. And I talked about chess with chess players. And then after I wrote that book, I wrote Garry Kasparov's biography. Garry Kasparov was the world champion. And in a sense, it was preposterous for a guy like me to be writing biography of the chess world champion, because I'm not even a weak amateur. I just know how to move the pieces. But I'm a good observer, and I would talk to Garry about the games, and I learned to translate the complexity of the life, the complexity of the games that he played into a language that a person that didn't know chess could understand, could dig, you know? So I'm practiced at that. And so when I began to write about Ralph's story, I knew that I needed to know everything. I needed to know it like the front and the back of my hand, because if I didn't, as you just pointed out, no one would believe it. Everybody would think that it didn't have authenticity, it wasn't real. So I knew what the stakes were going in, and we spoke for so many hours. And as I said a few minutes ago, part of the novel was the juxtaposition between a guy that doesn't know anything about homelessness, like most New Yorkers, and a homeless guy who's a profoundly homeless guy like Ralph. So I think that that sort of answers your question. I think. I hope.
Yeah, it does. It does. Um, in addition to, I guess, when you dive into a subject like this, obviously, and with the added component of having a personal relationship, I imagine that it affects you personally, obviously, with what you have to portray and maybe even some of the emotions you have to go through. So, just on a personal note, um, how did writing this book affect you personally? And did it change or supplement or affect your view of homelessness now versus when you started the book?
Those are two big questions. First of all, it did change my vision of homelessness. I mean, from entering into that world with my friends so deeply, it it was impossible to look at the people on the street in New York in the same way ever again. I mean, I have a profound attachment to their suffering and to their plight in life. Um, I could tell you stories. I don't even know where to go. It's so easy to talk about this. I mean, like there's a woman that lives on a park bench outside my house, which is just south of Greenwich Village. And she's been living there for a year and a half on the bench. She lives her life on the bench. She was living there with her husband all last winter. And many nights I would go down to the bench to bring them a blanket or bring them some food and see how they were faring. And he froze to death one night on the bench. She's still living on the bench. And whenever I'm not in New York now, I'm away with my family on vacation. But whenever I'm there, I don't want to overstate this. There are actually a couple of women that are neighbors that look in on her, that make sure she has food every day, that make sure she knows where to go to the bathroom. But yeah, I have a whole different vision of homeless people because of my relationship with Ralph. The other question was authenticity. You know, I think in a certain way I've already touched on this. I wouldn't touch a subject as an author unless I felt it, unless I could feel it deep inside me. I mean, because you would know if you read my book, if I started writing about, physics, for example, which I know nothing about, and I talked to a guy for a day or two and then tried to write a short story about a guy that did physics, you'd know from the second page that I was, excuse my language, bullshit. You'd know it. So authenticity is a very, very big deal for me. I've got to feel it in my blood or else I'm not ready to write it.
I know you're very politically aware and astute of things that are going on in the nation writ large. I have to ask, now having written this book and been done research and been involved in the homeless situation, what's your take on the recent Supreme Court ruling in Grant Pass versus Johnson, where they literally ruled that constitutional protection does not apply to people sleeping in public spaces? Do you have any thoughts on that opinion, especially now with this book out in such a timely manner?
I think it's preposterous. I don't understand it. In other words, homeless people can't afford to have a place to sleep, and often can't even have an old car to sleep in, and they pitch a tent someplace in a park um, to get out of the rain. And then the police say, well, you got to leave, and if you don't leave, you're going to get a $500 fine. I mean, I don't know who created such an idea. How are they going to pay the fine? And then what happens when they're out of jail but not paying the fine? You're going to sleep someplace else and you get picked up again and fined again, and they can't pay for that. It makes no sense to me. It has to be a better way. I'm not saying I know the better way, but that has to be preposterous.
Are you still in contact with Ralph? And if so, what are your conversations like now?
Well, Ralph, a lot of the book has to do with Ralph's transformation from a guy who was very affluent. His dad was owned 14 office buildings in Manhattan, but they were owned in a kind of like sub rosa way. You know, he had a business partner. His name was Sammy the Bull Gravano. He was sort of known for his murders. You know, and his father owned the original IBM building up in Westchester. He lost everything, and and at the time, Ralph was living in a beautiful Upper East Side apartment, and he was making his reputation as a philosopher. He was conferring with actually the top American philosopher, a guy by the name of Saul Kripke. He was dealing with the top philosophers in the world, and he was inventing things. He was inventing a lot of things. But he was being supported by his dad. He made some money from his inventions, but not enough to live his life. And when his father's business, as it were, fell apart, Ralph's sister took him from New York and brought him to a distant cousin's house in Florida. And the cousin was willing to put him up in a tiny little room about the size of a bathroom. He just had room for his computer and nothing else. But they didn't get along at all. The cousin didn't understand what Ralph was doing all day on the computer. He threw him out onto the street, and he became a homeless person. And that's where the story really begins.
And are you still in contact with him now, or have you talked to him recently?
Yes, I'm very much in contact with him. Ralph, during the 20 years that he was homeless, when he first got onto the street, he was so disoriented, confused, and incredulous. He became almost paralyzed. And over the course of the 20 years, he emerged from a kind of psychosis and became a lay psychologist because he was such a smart guy. And during many of the years that he was living on the street, he would sit on a park bench, and homeless guys would come over to him, and he would talk to them about their lives and try to make their lives more reasonable, more bearable. And he did this for hundreds of people. But to get to your question, when he was finally off the street after 20 years, and he lives in a tiny little Section 8 apartment, you know, about 500 square feet, 3 tiny rooms, but he does his philosophy. He can build a computer from the beginning to the end. Yes, I talk to him all the time. We're great friends now, great friends.
If I can, having such an accomplished writer like yourself on the Edric Show, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you a question about the process of writing. You're an accomplished writer in both the nonfiction and fiction world. So, how does your nonfiction approach to writing affect your ability to write fiction? Are they the same skill sets? Do you have to rely on different types of ways to think about writing fiction versus nonfiction? How are they intertwined? Because not very many people can do what you do, and that's, write in both worlds.
Well, I always wanted to be a novelist. And when I came out of graduate school and I tried to write, I spent about a year working in a cold water studio that my mom was a painter. She loaned it to me for a year. And I spent a year there trying to write the great American novel. I had the idea I was going to write something like Tolstoy's Anna Karenina or War and Peace, but I didn't do very well. I was unsuccessful. I just couldn't think of plots. And that's when I started writing nonfiction. I wrote a lot of pieces for the New York Times Magazine and for Esquire and for New York Magazine, other magazines as well. And what I learned was, well, first let me say this. I wrote all the pieces for those magazines in the first person, Fred. I was a character. And that was very unusual. It's not so unusual today, but when I was doing it, it was very unusual. There were a few very good writers that were doing that, but most people wrote in the third person, the omniscient narrator. But I wrote from my point of view. That was the first step towards writing fiction, because if you're writing from your own point of view, to some degree, you're already creating fiction, because I'm telling you what I think, not what is, but what I think. So that was really where I went to school to learn to be a fiction writer, as a journalist. And then when I started writing books, my first book, as you pointed out, Searching for Bobby Fischer, was a memoir. It was a true story. But after that, my last 4 books are the novels, but they've all been based in part on true stories. I think what a lot of readers don't understand is that almost all good novels are based on true stories. An example that I often give when I teach writing to people is we take Ernest Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea, for example, which is my favorite book when I was a kid, when I was 13 years old when I read it. It's such a fantastic story. And when I was 13 years old and I read it, I thought, how the hell did he ever think of a story like this? It's so cool. This old man catches a 1,500-pound blue marlin and the sharks eat it up. Oh my God, what a story. But the truth was, which I discovered later, was that there really was a Santiago, the old man, who was living in Cuba. And 15 years earlier, Hemingway had written a magazine piece about this old man and catching the marlin. And then he went back in 1951 or 1952 and wrote the novel. So what I realized after a while was that all novels have one foot in reality, but all great writers, or most great writers, I guess I shouldn't say all, but most really serious novelists start with a story that they know something about, characters that they know something about, and then they extemporize after that. And that's what I do. I mean, I think the difference is that in my books, if you look at the copyright page, it says, this is a work of fiction based upon a true story. But I think most novelists could say that if they wanted to.
My last question for you, and I apologize because it's a broad question, but given that you've been writing for decades, what are some of the changes, or what is one of the biggest changes you've seen in the publishing industry in terms of when you started and now?
It's a hard business. Whenever I teach, whenever I give instruction to young writers, which I do informally, but I love to look at the work of young writers and give them advice. I say, don't do this unless you have to do it. In other words, unless you have a crying need to do this and you'll feel unaccomplished in life if you don't, choose something else. It's so hard to make a living. There are so many people that are writing books, books without publishers, books with publishers, that it's very hard to get a handhold in the business. I mean, like, I have a friend who's a terrific writer. His name is Aidan Slade, and he's written a great novel, which is based on it takes place in the Mideast, and it's very violent. It's very sexual. It's very interesting. It's very compelling, and he can't get it published. He's going to get it published someday because he's a good writer, but he can't get it published. And he's been trying to get it published for 2.5 years. So is this a change in the business? Maybe, in the sense that there are more and more people um, trying to do it. I think that a lot of really talented writers that might have written great novels go into television and movies because you can make a decent living that way. I didn't want to do I had opportunities to do that earlier in my career, but I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to move out to LA, for example, and uproot my family. I liked living in New York, and I liked the shape of my life. And if I ended up earning less, it was okay. But it's a very hard way to make a living.
Well, Fred, as we wrap up, I do want to thank you for coming on the show. If people want more information about you or get a copy of the book, where can they go?
Well, you can get the book most easily on the sellers like Amazon and Barnes and Noble. I mean, Amazon very often has the book on for sale. Certainly, the Kindle's always up for sale. You can get it at a good sale price. If you want to read more about Fred Waitzkin, you can go to fredwaitzkin.com. I've got a very nice website, and probably most of the things you'd want to know are right there.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I do want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. I really appreciate it. I know you're on this press tour, and thank you for coming on the Edric Show.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I've enjoyed it very much.
Thank you very much. This has been another edition of the Edric Show. My guest has been renowned author Fred Waitzkin. His latest novel, Anything is Good, is available everywhere. Please check it out. And you can also check him out at fredwaitzkin.com. As promised, this is the place for intelligent conversation with interesting people. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell, and you'll get notified when I post content each and every week. I want to thank you for tuning in, and I will catch you on the next episode.